This is the second day of confirmation hearings for Trump's nominees and a hearing for Trump's second choice for Attorney General after his first nominee, Matt Gaetz, dropped out. Now, these hearings this week are big, both for the controversial nominees like ex-Fox host Pete Hegseth, the Pentagon pick grilled yesterday, while Marco Rubio and Pam Bondi in the hot seat today. So Democrats pressed Trump's second choice for Attorney General on her past election attacks.
I need to know that you would tell the president no.
Can you say no to the president of the United States?
President-elect Trump issues a directive or order to you or to the FBI director that is outside the boundaries of ethics or law.
I will never speak on a hypothetical.
Will you now retract your previous statements that Trump won Pennsylvania in the 2020 election?
Why do you have difficulty promising to preserve evidence at the Department of Justice?
I will follow the law.
It shouldn't be a difficult question.
Now, Republicans touted Bondi's credentials. She has solid experience. She was the Attorney General of a large state. They also likened any of the private lawyering, including on behalf of Donald Trump, as part of a long tradition of legal representation in this country.
Being Trump's lawyer prepares you for many things. So, yeah, you have a long-standing relationship with the president. He trusts you. That's a good thing.
Ms. Bondi is highly qualified. And, of course, as we all know, a change is desperately needed.
I urge every single member of this committee to support my friend Pam Bondi.
If you are confirmed as Attorney General, will you pledge to fairly and faithfully uphold the law regardless of party?
So help me God.
Amen.
Bondi has been a controversial pick since she replaced Gaetz. As Florida's former Attorney General, she has a resume, as mentioned, that fits the position. But Democrats were also trying to argue that what she did in lawyering, and as lawyers represent someone, they are supposed to be zealous advocates. That's the terminology. But the argument was that she went somehow beyond that, including defending Trump at his first impeachment and going so far as to traffic in debunked and false election claims.
Fake ballots that are coming in late.
Pam, did you just say fake ballots?
There could be. That's the problem.
The Department of Justice, the prosecutors will be prosecuted. The investigators will be investigated. Murderers, rapists from Venezuelan prisoners coming straight into our country. The deep state, last term for President Trump, they were hiding in the shadows. But now they have a spotlight on them.
Now, that wasn't her at work as a government official. That was her talking politics, is how they would put it. And you are allowed to do that in this country. The big question for a Senate, and any fair senator should care about this, shouldn't really be a party thing, is whether she can leave that at the door. You could have a doctor who has strong political views or even says things that seem outlandish. But when you're in the operating room, you want them only doing the medicine. And while I recognize people don't think lawyers fill the same societal value as doctors, sure, that's the idea here. And so here's how, you can hear it with your own ears, Bondi addressed those questions about some of those comments I just showed you today under oath.
Who won the 2020 presidential election?
Joe Biden is the president of the United States.
Are the felons convicted of breaking into the Capitol on January 6th hostages or patriots, quoting Trump?
I am not familiar with that statement.
I just familiarized you with that statement.
I'm not familiar with it, Senator.
Now, in some places where she could have tried to stand up and say something, be against something, draw a marker, a so-called line in the sand, she sort of passed. How do you interpret that? Well, speaking as someone who has covered a lot of these nomination hearings, even if you go back far enough, I worked as an aide in the United States Senate. Nominees who have the votes try to say as little as possible. You can infer negative or positive from that, but they generally try to avoid saying more to avoid getting into the kind of trouble that might detract from the votes they think they have. And unlike Donald Trump's first choice for the Attorney General position, Matt Gaetz, she seems to think as of today that she's got the votes and doesn't want to risk them or lose them. So what's the bigger question deeper than that? Well, as with many people at the FBI, we're going to see at DOJ, what are your standards? Is there a minimum line where even though you don't want to risk votes, you say, well, of course I'm against revenge prosecutions. Of course, I'm against crime at DOJ. And of course, I'm against an enemies list, even if the incoming FBI director pick is talking about enemies lists. Kash Patel has infamously spoken out about an enemies list and is now nominated to run the FBI. And to remind everyone, the FBI and the DOJ work together, FBI doing the police work and bringing in evidence, and the DOJ running the cases. So they have to work closely. Once it was clarified what enemies list she was being asked about, she did break with Patel. She did rebuke it. Take a listen.
Would you have hired someone into the Florida Attorney General's office who you knew had an enemies list?
Senator, to cut to the chase, you're clearly talking about Kash Patel. I believe that Kash is the right person at this time for this job.
And I'm questioning you right now about whether you will enforce an enemies list that he announced publicly on television.
Oh, Senator, I'm sorry. There will never be an enemies list within the Department of Justice.
Barbara?
Well, Kash Patel wrote a book called Government Gangsters, in which he lists by name a number of people that he says are part of the deep state and calls his enemies list about people that he will go after. Now, he's not had his own hearings yet. I think that those would be appropriate questions to ask him. But Pam Bondi here is sort of choosing to deflect this question. She says Kash Patel is highly qualified. She supports him, and yet there will be no enemies list at the Department of Justice. Those two things do not add up. And so I suppose that is perhaps a more appropriate question for Kash Patel. But you're right that she dodged, deflected, and danced around a lot of these questions without directly addressing the concern.
Right, and I showed, and she did dodge on something, certainly on the election stuff. But on the enemies list, if the FBI says here's the enemy and they want the DOJ to indict or further harass, target those people because they're on Patel's list, she seems to be saying under oath no to that.
I agree with that. I think that was probably the most direct she was today, because so often when a question like that came up, if Donald Trump directed you to do X or Y or Z, would you say no to him? She would often say, I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals. We heard an awful lot of that didn't give me a lot of assurance. But here, I think she did. I think that these will be good questions for Kash Patel, but I did take some comfort in the fact that she said that she would not have an enemies list, yet she does endorse Kash Patel.
Right. As for the dodging that you mentioned on something that used to be very simple, referring to past elections, and again, this is part of her job because the DOJ, along with other authorities, deals with enforcing the law, which sometimes involves tracking the lawful winners of elections, the results thereof, protecting the polls, et cetera. She said she's aware that Biden is president. I hope so. But wouldn't say that Trump lost to Biden in 2020, which is why he's president. Take a look.
Do you have any doubts that Joe Biden had the majority of votes, electoral votes, necessary to be elected president in 2020?
I accept, of course, that Joe Biden is president of the United States. I was on the ground in Pennsylvania, and I saw many things there. We should all want our elections to be free and fair.
And I think the length of your answer is an indication that you weren't prepared to answer yes.
What do you see there? And is it a problem that this has become a kind of a question some people have a hard time answering factually?
I think it's a tremendous problem. She clearly is willing to admit that Joe Biden is the president. He's in the White House. He's acting as president. But she will not go so far as to say that he won the 2020 election fair and square. You know, you could almost imagine that she's thinking to herself, Donald Trump is out there watching. I have to keep him happy. I have to say he won the election. I can't concede. And so she doesn't. And so she says this and did this repeatedly. I think this is very problematic for a person who's going to be the Attorney General of the United States if she is confirmed. This is a position, perhaps like no other, that requires steadfast integrity. She is going to find herself in very difficult situations where the executive branch is pushing her to do things that may be right up to the legal line. In this case, perhaps across the legal line. And we, the people, need to know that she will be strong enough to stand up to that. Her refusal to answer this question tells me that she is not.
Joining us now, Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman. I know she said she's going to put the Constitution above everything else. So why is it so hard for her? Please explain it to me. Why is it so hard for her and other nominees to comment on a hypothetical like that? If the president breaks the law, asked you to break the law, would you do it?
Katie, the way these hearings are designed is you don't need to answer any questions. You could get away with saying, I'm not going to talk about hypotheticals. My duty is to the Constitution. My duty is to the rule of law. And when you have a Senate Republican conference that is way, way more loyal to Donald Trump than it was in 2017 and even 2017 to 2021, you are going to have senators who are going to vote yes regardless. And quite frankly, Senate Republicans probably have one nominee that's standing that they could kill. They can't kill them all, and I don't think they want to get rid of Pam Bondi. But these hearings are just designed to be able to evade, and there's nothing that senators can do to force her into any nominee, not only Pam Bondi, but any nominee into a corner and force them to answer questions they don't want to answer, again, especially with the entirety of the Senate Republican conference marching lockstep behind her and Donald Trump.
Is it ultimately because the public isn't paying close attention? The public isn't demanding answers to questions like this?
Yeah, and I think a few things. I don't think that not anybody, I think the vast majority of people don't know and don't care who the Attorney General is. I don't know that, to be honest with you, I don't know that plays a difference in the confirmation process. I don't think it makes a difference. I don't think it plays a role. That's number one. And number two, I think that the nominees that go up to Capitol Hill, Donald Trump's nominees, know how to play to Trump. They know that what they have to say, what they should say, and what they shouldn't say to get confirmed. I mean, the real test here, Katie, will be somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who's nominated to be the Director of National Intelligence, who has a long history and many questions about her contacts with other countries, her previous distaste for FISA and for wiretapping capabilities that today CIA Director John Ratcliffe said make up the majority of the intelligence that is presented to the President of the United States. So all of that put together, I think that the playbook here is relatively clear.
What about Kash Patel? He came up quite a bit during this confirmation hearing. She was asked frequently about what she would demand of him, what she would allow him to do as head of the FBI if she were confirmed. Why so much concern about Kash Patel?
Well, number one, the basic premise that the FBI does fall under the Department of Justice. It's part of the Department of Justice. And I mean, then there's Kash Patel, the person, right? He has spoken a lot over the last 10 or so years about what he thinks of the government and what he would do if afforded power and if confirmed to be the FBI director. I would say, Katie, I am relatively surprised by how well received Kash Patel has been by members of the Senate Republican Conference. Maybe not surprised, but gobsmacked, perhaps, is the right way to say it, because it seems like, to be honest with you, the odds are that he will get confirmed as well. Can't swear to that. There's obviously two tiers of nominees here. There's the Marco Rubios, the Pam Bondis. I wouldn't put them in the same category, but the John Ratcliffe. That is the general column of people who are going to get confirmed. Doug Burgum, people like that. Then there's Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard, and Pete Hegseth, who's going to get confirmed, was perhaps in the latter category. Now he's no longer. He's most likely, almost certainly going to get confirmed. I think there is a volume of evidence that Kash Patel, what he would do if he was in charge of the FBI, and I think that will come up should he make it to a confirmation hearing.
One of the reasons why Kash Patel's name came up was that he has an enemies list. People that he thinks should be prosecuted. They talk about investigating the investigators. Jack Smith was one of those names that came up. Liz Cheney came up as well. But there was a particularly contentious moment between Adam Schiff, the new senator from California, obviously formerly a congressman who we all know well, asking her whether there would be an investigation into the special counsel, into Jack Smith. Let's listen.
The president has said Jack Smith should go to jail. Will you investigate Jack Smith?
Senator, I haven't seen the file. I haven't seen the investigation. I haven't looked at anything. It would be irresponsible of me to make a commitment regarding anything.
So a summary by the president or his desire to investigate Jack Smith would not be enough for you to open an investigation of Jack Smith. Is that right?
I will look at the facts and evidence in any case.
What is the desire on Capitol Hill to see these sorts of investigations, perhaps to see an investigation into a former colleague like Liz Cheney?
The appetite is quite high, to be honest with you. There's a lot of people in the House Republican Conference. By the way, they're standing right behind me right now in a room talking about tax reform. The appetite is quite high to see investigations into people like Jack Smith, Liz Cheney, people who have been involved in some of the January 6th prosecutions and investigations. The jury is out. We reported, Katie, just yesterday or the day before that there's active conversations between members of the January 6th committee and the Biden White House about potential pardons. And that is still very much on the table when it comes to members of the January 6th committee, Liz Cheney, Benny Thompson, people of that nature who have been very active and very outspoken about what Donald Trump did or did not do on January 6th.
And bring us up to speed on Rubio quickly and John Ratcliffe. They also faced hearings today. How did their confirmation processes go?
Very well. You could tell they're former members of Congress because they are very well equipped to answer questions and to proceed quite smoothly. I think these are going to be two of the earliest nominees that are confirmed, perhaps along with Pete Hegseth, to be honest with you. I would imagine that Hegseth is much closer to a party line vote. But I really think, Katie, that Marco Rubio and John Ratcliffe are going to get confirmed probably with wide bipartisan margins. I just think they are two of the, if you put them in the mix of all the people that Trump has nominated, two of the shining stars, according to Republicans and Democrats, people who are practiced, people who are well equipped for the job. You might not agree with them if you're a Democrat on everything, but you would have a tough time making a case that they're not qualified for the job.
All right, the confirmation process for President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet picks kicked off yesterday with the Senate Armed Services Committee holding a hearing for one of the most controversial choices, Defense Secretary pick Pete Hegseth. Hegseth, a combat veteran and former Fox News host with little experience in leadership, pitched himself as the much-needed change at the Pentagon and brushed off the numerous controversies surrounding him.
Now, it is true and has been acknowledged that I don't have a similar biography to defense secretaries of the last 30 years. But as President Trump also told me, we've repeatedly placed people atop the Pentagon with supposedly the right credentials, whether they are retired generals, academics, or defense contractor executives. And where has it gotten us? He believes, and I humbly agree, that it's time to give someone with dust on his boots the helm. A change agent, someone with no vested interest in certain companies or specific programs or approved narratives. My only special interest is the warfighter.
You know, there's so much that was said yesterday. It would literally take us 4 hours just to get through the misinformation that was put out there. But there's just some things that we just have to stop before we even go any further and talk through the fact that when somebody asks the question, where has it gotten us? Anybody that knows anything about the United States military, anybody that knows anything about today's United States military and our armed forces and the men and women that serve proudly will tell you America's military is more powerful relative to the rest of the world than any time, certainly in the last 25 years and perhaps since the post-war world. The fearsome ability of the United States military to extend power across the globe, unparalleled. And where has it gotten us? With a NATO that is stronger and more powerful than ever before. We have helped Ukraine wreck the second most powerful military in the world without losing a single American sailor or soldier or Marine or airman. And in Asia, China, more hemmed in today than ever before, because what we've done in Guam, what we've done in the Philippines, what we've done with Japan and South Korea becoming allies, what we've been doing with Australia, helping them build a nuclear navy. I could go on, but this idea, Republicans, that we need somebody with dust on their boots in this position, and the suggestion that we haven't had people with dust on their boots in this position is either willfully lying or willfully ignorant. We have had actually some of the most decorated, heroic, brave, battle-tested men that have been holding the top positions over the past 4 to 8 years in the military, and yes, women as well that have been there. So the idea that this is some feel-good exercise ignores the fact that whether from Mad Dog Mattis to General Milley, you have people that have been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, were there at the worst times in Fallujah, and it's just an insult. Just an absolute. And again, there's so much to talk about here.
Yeah.
But we've just got to go full stop, because I'm sick and tired of people tearing down the men and women in uniform that are protecting us. And I'm sick and tired. You know, if people want to lie about the economy, they can lie about the economy.
Well,
I don't take that as personally. I mean, because that's their own problem, because they're going to be judged by how they do compared to the United States economy right now, which is the envy of the world. We have record low jobless rates. The stock market's at record highs. I mean, they'll have to deal with that. But this insult that somehow our military is weak and woke is just an outrageous lie, and it's an insult to our men and women in uniform. I want to bring in right now General Barry McCaffrey. You talk about American heroes. He's had a little dust on his boots through the years. And, sir, we thank you. We thank you for your service to this country. Thank you also for getting up very early this morning on the West Coast.
Oh, my.
I want you to give me your general feelings about what you saw yesterday. But first, let's blow apart this lie that our military is weak and woke and not the strongest in the world by far. First, could we do that, sir?
Boy, that was such a terrific opening statement on your part. You know, this magnificent armed forces, active guard reserve, 2.1 million men and women in uniform. By the way, 1,000 some odd killed and wounded among women fighting in the war on terror. 60,000 some odd casualties in total. Enormously complex, globally deployed. The U.S. Navy's fighting actively day in and day out, trying to keep sea lanes open in the Middle East. It is astonishing, the courage, the devotion to duty that we see among the active duty. And by the way, everybody goes back to Afghanistan, the disgrace of the withdrawal. Mr. Trump ran for presidency and said he's going to get us out of Afghanistan. And he handed Biden, who ran for office to get out of Afghanistan, a situation with 2,500 troops on the ground. We pulled out over 100,000 screaming civilians in a miracle operation that could have been the French defeated Dien Bien Phu because we put 7 elite battalions on the ground and intimidated the Taliban, who had been 7,000 of whom had been released by Mr. Trump. So there's a lot of nonsense floating around. But look, the hearing yesterday, divisive, partisan, in some ways an unqualified candidate. He did remarkably well. He's articulate, he's smart, he's a decorated combat veteran, he's a Princeton grad, he's quick on his feet, he's going to get confirmed. Senator Jack Reed, my friend, said it all in his opening statement: behavioral problems, alcohol abuse, lack of experience, his statements on the role of women in the armed forces. So we're in a period, though, where we got to remind ourselves the real problem is Mr. Trump suggesting we might invade Greenland. We might seize the Panama Canal. We might use military power against drug cartels in Mexico. We might coerce Canada into being the 51st state. This is comical stuff. That's going to be the challenge, less so Mr. Hegseth.
Well, here are some of the key lines of questioning from of Hegseth from Democrats in yesterday's hearing. Take a listen.
I do not believe that you are qualified to meet the overwhelming demands of this job. We must acknowledge the concerning public reports against you. A variety of sources, including your own writings, implicate you with disregarding the laws of war, financial mismanagement, racist and sexist remarks about men and women in uniform, alcohol abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other troubling issues. I have reviewed many of these allegations and find them extremely alarming. Indeed, the totality of your own writings and alleged conduct would disqualify any service member from holding any leadership position in the military, much less being confirmed as the Secretary of Defense.
An event in North Carolina, drunk in front of 3 young female staff members after you had instituted a no alcohol policy and then reversed it. True or false?
Anonymous smears.
December of 2014 at the CVA Christmas party at the Grand Hyatt at Washington, D.C., you were noticeably intoxicated and had to be carried up to your room. Is that true or false?
Anonymous smears.
Another time, a CVA staffer stated that you passed out in the back of a party bus. Is that true or false?
Anonymous smears.
I'm going to leave with concerns about your transparency. You say you've had personal issues in your past, yet when asked about those very issues, you blame an anonymous smear campaign, even when many of these claims are not anonymous. Which is it? Have you overcome personal issues, or are you the target of a smear campaign? It can't be both.
Senator, I sit here before you in open book, as everyone who's watched this process.
With multiple non-disclosure and confidentiality agreements tying the hands of many people who would like to comment to us. Many of your work colleagues have said that you show up for work under the influence of alcohol or drunk. I know you've denied that, but you would agree with me, right, that if that was the case, that would be disqualifying for somebody to be Secretary of Defense.
Senator, those are all anonymous false claims, and the totality
they're not anonymous.
The letters on the record here.
They're not anonymous.
On the record,
we've seen records with names attached to them. One of your colleagues said that you got drunk at an event at a bar and chanted, "Kill all Muslims." Another colleague, not anonymous, we have this, said that you took coworkers to a strip club. You were drunk, you tried to dance with strippers, you had to be held off the stage, and one of your employees in that event filed a sexual harassment charge as a result of it. Now, I know you denied these things, but isn't that the kind of behavior that, if true, would be disqualifying for somebody to be Secretary of Defense?
Senator, anonymous false charges.
They're not anonymous. And I'll just conclude and say this to the chairman. You claim that this was all anonymous. We have seen records with names attached to all of these, including the name of your own mother. So don't make this into some anonymous press thing. We have seen multiple names of colleagues consistently throughout your career that have talked about your abusive actions.
Senator Tim Kaine pressing there on Pete Hegseth. Despite everything we heard over those several hours yesterday, following that hearing, Hegseth did pick up the support of Republican Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, significant for a number of reasons, because she's a combat veteran, distinguished career in the military, also a survivor of sexual assault, who is seen as one of the most likely Republicans who could potentially vote against him. To the confirmation hearings on Capitol Hill of Pete Hegseth to become the next Secretary of Defense. Among the Democrats asking questions, first-term Senator Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan, who pressed the former Fox News host and military veteran on whether he would carry out an illegal order if President Trump were to issue one.
What I think I'm most concerned with is that no president has the right
to use the uniformed military in a way that violates the U.S. Constitution and further taints the military as that apolitical institution that we all want, right? And our founders designed the system so that, we had posse comitatus, that we weren't going to use active duty military inside the United States and make American citizens potentially scared of their own military. We went through our own experience with that with the British. As the Secretary of Defense, you will be the one man standing in the breach should President Trump give an illegal order, right? I'm not saying he will, but if he does, you are going to be the guy that he calls to implement this order. Do you agree that there are some orders that can be given by the Commander-in-Chief that would violate the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, thank you for your service. But I reject the premise that President Trump is going to be giving illegal orders.
No, I'm not saying he will, but do you believe there is such a thing as an illegal order that Joe Biden or any other president, Donald Trump, could give? Is there anything that a commander-in-chief could ask you to do with the uniformed military that would be in violation of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, anybody of any party could give an order that is against the Constitution or against the law.
Right. Okay. So are you saying that you would stand in the breach and push back if you were given an illegal order?
I start by saying I reject the premise that President Trump will be giving
you've done your
any
genuflecting
illegal
to him,
orders
but
at all.
This isn't a hypothetical, okay? Your predecessor in a Trump administration, Secretary Esper, was asked and did use uniformed military to clear unarmed protesters. He was given the order to potentially shoot at them. Helos flew low in Washington, D.C. as crowd control. He later apologized publicly for those actions. Was he right or wrong to apologize?
Senator, I was there on the ground.
And
I saw
I understand, and I respect that.
I've been there.
But you're about to be the Secretary of Defense
that was involved in that moment. I
was
also
he right to? So he was
legality and the Constitution.
Sir, was he right or wrong to
have.
apologize?
I'm not going to put words in the mouth of Secretary Esper or anybody else.
He said them himself. You don't have to. What are you scared of? Did he do the right thing by apologizing?
I'm not scared of anything, Senator.
Then say yes or no. You can say no.
The laws and the Constitution.
No answer. Senator Slotkin joins us now. She serves on the Armed Services and Veterans Affairs Committees. Also with us, NBC News Senior Executive Editor for National Security, David Rohde. Good morning to you both. Senator, obviously a frustrating line of questioning there. You never got an answer. I think a lot of your colleagues on the Democratic side would say the same in their lines of questioning, never getting a firm answer or anything satisfying. Based on what you heard yesterday in that hearing, how will you vote?
Well, look, it's not that hearing gave me more confidence in his ability to be the Secretary of Defense. I mean, I've worked for 4 Secretaries of Defense, Democrat and Republican, very proudly. I've gone up for Senate confirmation to be an Assistant Secretary of Defense. I've seen secretaries make life and death decisions in the dark of night that actually impact deeply the security of Americans. So that hearing did not give me more confidence. He did something a little bit unusual. He did not meet with any of the Senate Democrats, with the exception of the ranking member, before the hearing, but instead scheduled meetings with us after the hearing. I was supposed to have one today. He postponed it. I'm still willing to meet with him. So I'm going to withhold final judgment until I have that private conversation. Maybe he can say something, particularly on the constitutional issues. But if he wasn't willing to say them in public, I don't have a ton of confidence that he feels them as strongly as I'd like him to feel them.
What did you make, Senator, of the performance, the lines of questioning, the defense of Pete Hegseth by your Republican colleagues all down the line? Do you believe there's anyone on the Republican side in the United States Senate, on the Republican side of things, that will vote against this nomination?
Well, the senators on the Republican side will be typically the first ones to talk to you about the importance of national defense and national security, and I'm right there with them on the importance of it. But it was therefore hard to watch, as many of them literally just gave them softballs. I mean, pitched them. And in some cases just made the case for him. And I think that regardless of whether you're going to vote for him or not, at least exercise the role of the committee, which is oversight, right? As our founders intended, just oversee push and prod on behalf of the 3 million people in the Department of Defense. So it was a little disappointing to see people who I know have asked tough questions of others, including other Republican secretaries of defense, then kind of just like give him a softball and watch him hit it out of the park.
Senator Slotkin, good morning. It wasn't just that he had no answer there to that line of questioning, but also in the hearing yesterday, he gave no answer at all to whether or not he would uphold the Geneva Conventions. Of course, such a foundational agreement, one to protect U.S. soldiers abroad. What is your make of that? How troubling do you find that revelation?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to follow up a little bit at the end of my questioning about the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Is he going to interfere with that? You know, he has been known to defend strenuously soldiers who were convicted of war crimes, whose own fellow soldiers in their own fellow unit, in his own unit, turned him in and said, this is what he just did. He just shot at innocent Afghans. Mr. Hegseth is known very widely as defending him and getting President Trump to pardon them. And so I want to know, you know, what standards is he going to be upholding? Is he going to uphold the Uniform Code? Is he going to interfere in the Uniform Code? He actually didn't give me a lot of comfort on that. He said, well, it's my job to be involved in that. Well, if you're going to go mucking around with individual soldiers and the system of justice that has governed this institution for its entire founding, it's very concerning because he's got to be the guy who's holding up these values for our institution.
Senator, were you given access, were you able to read the FBI report on Pete Hegseth?
I was not. The ranking member and the chairman were the only ones, as I understand it, on the committee who were given access to it. And, you know, again, this is just sort of one of those due diligence, like, let's just be transparent. You want to run one of the most important institutions in the world, just make that report available. And so, you know, I didn't. I don't know that it has. I've heard it's kind of thin. But I think, again, if I were him, I would want to be full transparency given some of the negative stuff that's out there.
Were you under the impression that you would automatically receive the ability to read the whole report yourself as a United States Senator sitting in the committee?
Again, I think what we all have to remember is in the era of President Trump, you know, there are norms and there are laws. And President Trump and his nominees do not tend to follow norms. Of course, the norm is that an FBI report on any candidate, on anyone up for you know, confirmation, Democrat or Republican, that information would be made available. Think of Supreme Court justices, think of other cabinet level officials. But it's a norm, not a law. And I think it's a harbinger of what's to come, right? We should all be aware that as of Monday, a lot of the norms that have kind of governed Democrats and Republicans, again, are going to be upended. And so I would have liked to have seen it. I still hope to see it. But I'm not shocked that they're breaking some of these norms.
So, Senator, was there anything you heard from Pete Hegseth in this hearing that showed he had the experience, the temperament, and the knowledge to lead the Pentagon? What was the best thing you heard and the most concerning?
Well, I do want to say, you know, I understand that we've had certain standards for prior secretaries of defense. But I think what you heard in that room on the Republican side, and I come from a state that Trump won, right? I just won on the ballot in November, and so did Donald Trump. People are looking for a disruptor, right? People are saying, well, you know, he doesn't have the typical experience. That's not a negative to a lot of Americans right now. So I think that for me, I think what I'm concerned about is that under Trump the last time, General Mattis was his first Secretary of Defense. I had served in and around him for a long time. I trusted that if the president had asked him to do something that would taint forever the view of Americans of their military, that General Mattis would have said no. Secretary Esper, we didn't always agree on things, but when push came to shove and Lafayette Square happened and there was outrage by retired military across the board, he apologized and he said, I'm not going to use, for instance, the 82nd Airborne active duty troops. He stood up. And I think what I'm concerned about is that as we go into a second administration, he's not looking for people who are standing up for the institutions.
Yeah. Senator, I want to ask you about transparency, and maybe you can explain this to us, how it worked, who may have blocked information from getting to the American people. So they could have a more educated judgment on this nominee. But time and again, and it really was highlighted by Tim Kaine, he would talk about some of the most disturbing incidences in Pete Hegseth's background. And Pete Hegseth would call them anonymous smears. And then Senator Kaine would follow up and say, well, actually, they're not. These are whistleblower reports, and we have names attached to these whistleblower reports.
Yeah.
Mark Kelly said the same thing. Mark Kelly brought up a really good line and basically said, if you've had this road to Damascus experience, where you've had this great conversion, that's inconsistent with you saying it never happened before, that it was anonymous smear. So it's trying to have it both ways. But I am curious, why is it that the American people were not able to see those whistleblower reports that would have attached names to these deeply disturbing incidences for a lot of Americans? And instead, he could just say something that was obviously a lie when he said they're anonymous smears. Because, again, as Senator Kaine and others said, they weren't anonymous smears. There were names attached. Republicans just didn't want Americans to see those whistleblower reports. Can those reports come out? How could the Republicans have stopped them from coming out?
Yeah, again, this is norms versus laws. And I think what you have here is just, my Republican colleagues are now in the majority as of, last week, and they are setting the rules for these committee hearings. I mean, we're hoping to keep the standard of just having the certain senior members of the committee see these FBI reports. And I think, again, we're just going to have to press and try to make the case and appeal to people and their conscience about some of these nominees. But I also will say, it's not crazy for some of these folks to be very concerned about retribution. Not the Republican senators. I'm talking about the whistleblowers, the former family members of Mr. Hegseth. I think we've heard rumors that there's a lot of concern about coming and being public, putting your name out there, coming and testifying, coming and talking to people because of a fear of retribution. And so I just, again, this is norms versus laws. We all know that on Monday, the President Trump, what we hear is potentially 100 executive orders in at least the first couple of weeks. So we hang on to our hats here. Things are going to come fast and furious. And there are substantive issues to look at, separate even from just process.
You did your best to get to some of the truth yesterday in that hearing. Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin of Michigan. Senator, we always appreciate you being with us. Thank you.